Hi, I'm Gary, and this is episode 260 of EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. On the show today, it's a roundtable episode. This season of the podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence wherever you go. Now, our main topic of discussion today, well, it's actually a multitude of topics as we bring you the Season 13 season-ending roundtable episode, which is our regular end-of-season show. And as usual on these episodes, I invite a number of different people on. Each one presents a topic of interest, which they introduce and open to the panel for a discussion. And when we've set the world to rights with that topic, we move on to another topic. So let me start by introducing the guests. My first guest is Gemma Robinson. Gemma works for HITRANS, which is the Highland and Islands Transport Partnership. And she's a project manager looking after EV infrastructure there. Welcome, Gemma.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks for having me today.
My pleasure. My next guest is Ed Walsh. Ed is a former podcast guest from last season, I believe, when he came in to talk about the ZapMap app, which is today's tongue twister, and the future direction of the product in his role of head of product at ZapMap. Welcome, Ed.
Great to be here. Thanks, Gary.
My final panelist is Ben McDonald. Ben was on the podcast back in episode 214, I believe, which was the Pavement Charger number 2 episode, where he came in and talked about Nodem and the Charge Bridge offering, which is a product that they produce for people who don't have a driveway but can park more or less outside their house. Oh, welcome, Ben.
Hi, Gary. Thanks for having me.
Welcome to everybody. This is the point in where I open the discussion with our first panelist, who is Gemma. So, Gemma, could you introduce your topic and lead the debate for us, please?
Yeah. I am looking today at how the approach to rural charging infrastructure has changed. I work in the public sector on the strategy and delivery of EV charging infrastructure across very rural areas, including some Scottish islands. I've had some very quizzical looks questioning why I would do that. So I'm keen to explore and understand a range of opinions on this. There are some key challenges to first installing and then operating a rural charging network. Grid connection costs can be higher and riskier than in urban or suburban areas. Utilisation can be low, but can also fluctuate widely with tourism. Maintenance can be costly, with engineers slowed by the terrain and availability of routes, making the regulated 99% reliability harder to achieve. Understandably, none of that's great for profit. So generally speaking, to date, rural locations haven't offered a good commercial incentive to provide charging. But at the same time, national EV uptake is increasing beyond tipping point to the majority of the market. And in such a competitive industry, charge point operators are looking for expansion opportunities. And national funding programs are inviting a huge rise in private and public partnerships that work together to provide regional charging networks that work for everyone, both of which need data support. So my question is, what changes are you seeing in the approach to rural EV charging provision, and what changes do you hope to see in the future?
That's a good one. Anyone like to take a stab at that? I have my own thoughts, but I'll open it up to the floor.
I think I'll just jump in with something which is a common misnomer. I think a lot of people think that because it's the rural landscape, there's going to be space for people to park off street, and that's certainly not the case. When you look at some of the kind of curtilages of the villages, especially the historic kind of cores, it's often the case that they were built pre-advent of the car, and so you find that so often there's not really the space and pavement space to be able to install a charger, and there's not the ability to park off street. So I think a lot of the kind of problems that people find in dense urban areas also happen in village cores as well. So I think the challenge isn't necessarily just one of always slapping in loads of public charging, but it's also about finding other solutions that could enable people to charge using their own home tariff, to bang that drum early on in the episode.
That's quite all right. That's fine. We'll be banging that drum several times, I would imagine. Ed, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Ben says, there's definitely, we need a mix of solutions here. And I think there's obviously a lot of funding that's going into rolling out solutions in rural areas, but we need to make sure that that's the right mix, that, as Gemma mentioned, it kind of balances that demand from tourists, which will fluctuate through the seasons, and doesn't just cater for them at the cost of those that live there in the local area. ideally, where possible, that it makes use of existing resources. So whether that's, local car parks that you can put them in that are in people's general day-to-day patterns, whether it's use of supermarket areas and making sure that these are obviously hubs that people go to in any case, and so that generally have the space to provide good charging options, and where possible, where you can get hubs deployed on key crossroads and intersections of infrastructure. So I think it has to be a real mix of solutions, but I definitely think, as Ben mentions, some innovation within the home and with shared charging and making sure that those that don't have off-street parking is absolutely key as well. So it's a big challenge, but I think there's a real range and a real mix that can support it.
Let me put my charge point operator hat on. Not that I have a charge point operator hat, but having spoken to a couple of them, one of the things that they're going to put up as a quote unquote barrier in a situation like this is exactly the same thing that we had when we were talking about Wales, because for quite a long while, Wales was one of the charging wastelands in the UK. There was very little charging infrastructure there. And when I pressed a lot of the charge point operators on this, their pushback was, well, there aren't a lot of people there. And when you get into, the Brecon Beacons and things like that, there just isn't the grid to support it. So I'm going to assume that those kind of challenges are also the same in the Highlands and Islands. Would that be a fair thing to say, Gemma?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Sorry.
No, go on.
Yeah, I think it's one of the key things I would like to see in the future change is being able to utilise local energy or battery storage options for rural charging, because grid constraint, grid curtailment is a massive challenge. It's costly for both installers and the customer at the end of the day.
The other kind of aspect of this, and this links back to the podcast that was released a couple of weeks ago, I talked to John Fairley at AW Energy, and they've got a nice charging hub at Checkley Wood, which is Kempower ultra rapid charging at 39 pence a kilowatt hour. And the reason they've been able to do that is because they have an on-site wind turbine. Now, it's been a while since I've been up in the north of Scotland, but my recollection is quite windy up there. Is that something that's kind of considered? Would it be a situation, would it be fairly easy to sort of replicate that in a number of places in the Highlands?
I don't think I ever say easy in this industry, but it's definitely a model I am looking to find out more about and utilise up here. There's a lot more solar models than there are wind power models. I think Checkley Wood was a world first, so really keen to see that up here. And I know there's plenty of local smaller wind turbines as well that maybe that would work for.
What do you see as the biggest sorry, we'll come back to you in a second, Ben. What do you see as the biggest challenge, the one barrier that's in the way to stop this working as quickly and as efficiently as you'd like to see? I'll put
Can I have
spot,
three?
I'm sorry.
I have three.
Yes.
One for me is a bit like you were saying with Wales. There's that low utilisation in rural areas, and I think collaboration on that utilisation is going to be key to making them viable long term, just to get as many people using their charge points as possible. I think maintenance in rural areas is a real issue. I think we really need to look at some local maintenance to be able to make those chargers more reliable, increase people's confidence in them, and encourage that uptake. And that energy piece, and I think the hardest thing for the energy piece is the complexity of that energy system and how we fit into that. There's so much going on in the EV world at pace as well, that to then link it to the energy sector, which is also happening at pace and at the same time, is quite a challenge, certainly from my point of view.
I think, well, I was just going to mention, I was reading into this last week, and one of the things that's highlighted is the gap in between, or the hole in private sector investment in some of these areas because of the challenges that you mentioned in actually demonstrating you can drive real utilisation. And I think you have to have this blend of making sure local authorities are supported, but also we're doing the broader change to support CPOs with driving up utilisation across their whole network. So where they have high points, they can support the investment in the lower points. And so many of the changes that will support the improvements within rural areas are actually all of the things that we should be doing to ensure that CPOs are supported with delivering charging, I guess, a high level of utilization across their whole network, even if you have high points and low points, and that is done in a viable way with, the right kind of changes around the price of that charging and the cost of energy. So I think many of the things that will support that private sector investment coming up are many of the things that we're talking about throughout the whole of the UK.
Can I come in there? Because the Highlands have just awarded a contract for some of their network, well, all of their network. And it has that portfolio approach where some of the busier chargers will support some of the less utilised ones. But that private-public partnership, I think, across the whole of the UK with Levi and EVIF funding, to me, it feels a little bit like private and public together becomes like a B Corp. So everyone's focused on the customer, the people side of it, but the public sector focuses on the place side and the private sector focuses on the sort of profit side. And together, it seems like they're a bit of a B Corp sort of organisation. I'm a big fan of B Corps. So yeah, I think that could be a really good thing going forwards.
Anybody want to say anything on?
Can I jump in thinking about, for me, it seems quite logical that you really need to apply an ecosystem approach to the charging and also the energy needs within those kind of rural areas. And I'm quite intrigued by the huge variation that you get as a result of tourism and so on. So I was kind of wondering whether or not there would be any method in having battery energy storage systems associated with the charging points so that during those summer months when you get a lot of busyness and a lot of people charging, they can be used for charging. But then during the winter months when you're going to want to heat people's homes and find some sort of ways of balancing out the grid during the dreaded Dunkelflaute or whatever it might be, you can use those assets for a different purpose. So I think there's potentially something that could be done there that adopts that approach, because a lithium ion battery in a container can be used for multiple different things. And so if you could sort of see it with a broader lens, it could be quite an interesting model that some of these CPOs could use, perhaps.
I think, as you were saying earlier, it's that whole community piece.
I think, sort of moving on from what Ben was saying there are a number of options and solutions out there that would allow exactly what you've said to happen. There are portable battery storage, which you can take out and use on a site. And then, as you say, when they're not needed on that particular site, they can be redeployed elsewhere. Now, obviously, there's going to be logistics issues around getting that to work, but it's not an insurmountable problem. So I think that's a great suggestion. Excellent.
I think that was my point, Gary. Sorry, is just, you were talking about the amount of innovation earlier and how many different opportunities there are out there that are coming up. I think another one I'm seeing as well is charging as a service coming into some of the regions. So
wonderful. Anything else to say on this before we move on?
No, really great to hear what everyone else is seeing in that space, though.
Excellent. Thank you,
So
Gemma.
do you
Great
think
topic.
I'll be able to do the 500? What is it? So the big trip around
the NC 500?
Sorry?
The NC 500, the North Coast
Yes.
500, yeah.
Would that be a stressful thing to do in the height of summer, or do you think it would be kind of possible?
I think it'd be stressful to do in the height of summer more because of the amount of cars and traffic jams more than the charging issues. I think the NC 500 is fairly well covered now. And I think there's quite a lot of provision, both public and accommodation wise as well. So yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility.
Moving on. Ed, what's your specialist subject today then, please?
So I wanted to talk about the second-hand market, and I guess thinking about it from two perspectives. One is most people don't buy new cars, and so we need to make sure that the right second-hand cars are there for them and they are supported in buying, and by doing so we're supporting EV becoming the best option for everyone. And the second reason is it's absolutely vital for the fleet market. So as we know, most new electric vehicles go into fleet and then after a period will go into the second-hand market. And the reason it's so important for them is if there's a massive price drop, then effectively they're paying the cost of moving quickly on EV because they're paying a high price for an EV and then it goes on a low price into the second-hand market. And the main reason this came to mind is I had one of my friends buy a second-hand EV recently. He spent £10,000. He got an MG5. He is so happy with it. He gets 200 miles or so of range. The thing that he said to me is, I never have to stop because of the range. I've got a couple of kids and they're always the reason I'm going to be stopping. So it's never a problem to me. He doesn't have a home charger, and as yet, he doesn't yet have a really clear charging strategy. He uses a supermarket. He's got a new charge point that's being commissioned nearby. He's got some friendly neighbours that he can share with. And overall, he's absolutely loving it. So the reason I wanted to talk about it is I think there's some great stories out there and people are getting great EVs for £10,000 or below now. It's absolutely vital for the fleet market that we have a strong second-hand market that they can sell on into. So my question to the group was, what can we do? How can we ensure that this second-hand market does grow and go from strength to strength over the coming years?
That is a rich topic, I think. I think everybody's going to have an opinion on that. I'm going to open this to Ben because I'm pretty sure he's got something to say on this.
It's a challenging one, and I certainly kind of understand that for those people who are working in the lease companies, they've got such an issue with the residual values of vehicles, and it's not just EVs; it's actually across the portfolio. I do think some of them got, dare I say, a little bit fat during the pandemic when they were kind of having secondhand prices going through the roof. We've still got a little 3-pot asthmatic Volkswagen Up, and we bought it in 2016 when I couldn't afford to buy a secondhand Nissan Leaf. And after having that for 4 years and putting maybe 15,000 miles on the clock, we were actually could have sold it for more than we actually bought it for. So trying to understand these variations in the market are really, really challenging. And so I certainly don't envy them. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to say following on from that, but they do need to play the long game. But this is a transition, and it's going to take place over 10, 15 years. And you can't kind of dine out on massive profits one year and pay out large dividends and then expect someone to come to rescue you when things have become a little bit more challenging, sort of 2 years, 3 years down the track. Yes, there is a little bit of it that I think the lease companies are going to have to suck it up and find ways to make it work. It will change, I think, as people start to recognize that batteries are outlasting cars in many situations. It's going to give people a lot more confidence in buying a second-hand EV. I wouldn't have any qualms in buying an EV that's done 50,000 miles. There's some great companies that are being stood up at the moment to look at battery health, and that's going to give people a lot more confidence. And when you start thinking about the total cost of ownership, a second-hand EV makes sense. Like you can buy, I'm going to say that word, a Tesla Model 3 for for under 10K that can do 200 miles of range. It's extraordinary. It's challenging for some, but it's a massive opportunity for others.
Absolutely. I'm, as of the day, in fact, today, the day we're recording this, the lease on my current electric vehicle runs out, and I'm going to roll it over on a month-by-month basis, but I am looking for a reasonably high mileage second-hand electric vehicle that I can use to replace it with. Now, whether I buy that outright or whether I get that on a PCP for 3 or 4 years and then pay the bubble payment at the end to take outright ownership, that's a discussion that I've got to work out in my own mind. But it's definitely the way I want to go, rather than going back to a brand new car on a brand new lease, because, as you said, the financials work out. Gemma, any thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about incentives, actually. So local and government incentives. The Energy Savings Trust at the moment have a interest-free loan for second-hand cars for anyone under an income of 50k or in rural areas, actually, which is for a second-hand car under £23,000. We're payable over 6 years. So I think that's a massive incentive for people. I've got a friend in the village who has taken that up. And it was interesting to see her go through the EV learning journey, actually, and realised that it's not nearly as big a deal as she thought it would be. But as well as that, I think there's local incentives. I know Orkney's been a very progressive place in terms of EV uptake for many years, and one of the biggest drives for that was eco cars, which takes people's request for a type of car and finds it at auction and imports it secondhand to Orkney. And that's made it affordable for locals to buy those EVs and drive that market. And so I think that's a really good example of a local incentive. And just coming back to Ben's point, I would say that sort of standardized battery health check would give a lot of people confidence to buy EVs. I know they're available, but I don't think they're necessarily sort of standardized or recognized yet.
Yeah. You're absolutely right, and I think we've done some exploration with some partners on that, and they all have their own models for how they assess that. But they're definitely still getting to a point where you could say there's a standard that everyone is sticking to, and this is how we assess it, and we're comfortable with it. But I think you're right on incentives. I think also having those clear and in the public eye is a really important thing. But I think we could be doing more. The BVRLA and the EVA did a piece of research recently, and in fact, there was a letter to Parliament on the back of it asking for some things that could support in this area. And one of the things they did call out is a clear grant for purchasing second-hand EVs, potentially a drop in VAT as well, more focus on ensuring that these used EV salary sacrifice schemes are accessible for everyone. There's lots in there. And I think your point, Ben, actually understanding the battery piece and ensuring that there's not all of this misinformation about it. Lots of studies saying they degrade at 1.8 to 2% a year, and if driven well, are going to last a long, long time. And I think that's not necessarily the public's perception of how EV batteries will last. I think what we also need to do is make sure people know what it means to drive an EV well. So when you should be doing rapid charging, what the impact of only doing rapid charging, how you need to make sure you're broadly staying in maybe 20 to 80% rather than charging all at the extremes. So I think there's a lot that we can do to help the public in understanding what incentives are there, creating better incentives for them, and also creating the right information sources for them to be really confident in their choice.
If only there was a podcast that provided all that education.
Exactly. You're absolutely right.
Coming back to that education piece, I think we have now got, there must be at least a couple of million people in the country who have got decent experience with EVs. And most people are more likely to listen to a friend, a family member, someone, than they are to listen to something on the news or seek out that information from a reputable source. I do think it's one of those things that's going to compound, and people are going to start to recognize very quickly that it just makes sense. And the scare stories that you do read are there because they're unusual. It's like battery fires. They hit the news because they are odd when they're an electric vehicle. I don't know why I had something appear in my newsfeed about an electric vehicle catching fire in a car park in Australia. It makes no sense. It's got no meaning to me. It's got no purpose, but it's just because it was an odd thing. So I think that misinformation piece is going to be solved by people's experiences, not always. It's Gary, as much as your podcast is fantastic, and I listen to it all the time, and you can repeat that as much as you like. It's going to be people's experiences that really change.
And I think that's where we've got a really key role. We can get those case studies out there, talking about people that drive a family estate and have an option that's under £10,000. It will get them to their long-term destination, and they absolutely love it, even when they live in a terraced house. Suddenly that lights up a lot of people, and they say, okay, that is someone like me, and I can actually do this. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Ben.
Just coming back to the incentives piece, given what the price point of a very competent second-hand electric vehicle is that not incentive enough to kind of play devil's advocate a little bit? I know that's your role, Gary, but sorry. Is that not incentive enough at the moment, do we think, or?
I think it's getting there. I think what we're seeing, I certainly think looking at the second-hand market today compared to a year ago, the choices are infinitely better. And I think you'll see that again in a year's time. And progressively, we'll get to a point where it just makes good sense for most. I don't think we're quite there yet. And I think there are things, the thing that incentives do is it's a headline figure in itself. And as you say, a fire of one single fire, the other side of the world, can be a headline. But I think a clear statement incentive is a headline and a really real statement of intent for the whole industry.
Fair point.
Yeah. I was just going to say, sort of coming back to what Ben was saying, one of the key drivers, as far as I'm concerned, is, for example, I've had an electric car for nearly 7 years now. In that time, I've personally been responsible for at least 4 people that I know moving to electric vehicles. So if every one of those is then responsible for 2 people or 3 people, that's how we start to increase the uptake, that's how you start to get those personal stories. Just like you were saying, Ed, I'm saving a fortune because I'm not having to spend this much on fuel. It's a lot nicer vehicle to drive than the old one that I had. I don't bother about the range because the kids are the issue rather than the car itself. And it's all right, as you say, Ben, it's all right for me to stand up on a podcast here and talk about all these things. But it's the personal, it's the one-on-one, I've done it. I've been through this process and I know the good and the bad, and I'm very, very happy with what I've got. And when people hear that gives them a lot more confidence to go out and sort of make the leap.
Absolutely.
Did you have a final comment, Gemma, before we move on?
It was just a small point, actually. I was speaking to Paul Kirby the other day and he got sidetracked looking at the price of a second-hand van. And for something that's 30k new with 20 miles on the clock, it was £8,000. And, vans are only just becoming kind of affordable in an EV sense. So that's, as Ben said, I think that's a massive incentive.
Did you send me the link?
It's probably gone. Paul probably bought it.
Paul Kirby talking about vans. Say ain't so. Ben, thanks for that. Ed, thanks for that. We're going to have to move on. We're starting to run a bit short on time. So I want to hand over to Ben. What is your topic of discussion today, please?
I'm going to start just by framing my supposition a little bit before throwing the question in. Three big things are happening that mean we're going to switch largely to an origin and destination charging model. And a big part of that is a technological shift. So as we're seeing cars' range increase, it's less and less likely that you're going to want to stop to charge at a rapid charging point. You're going to breeze on past them and stop at your hotel or your neighbors. I think people's familiarity with EVs is increasing, and it means that more and more people are not treating them like a traditional wet fuel vehicle. They're charging them in a different way. So you just kind of trickle charge them overnight or whatever it might mean. And more and more people are going to want to have the experience. I think government policy is starting to catch up with innovation. We saw the cross-pavement guidance that was produced by the DFT just prior to on Christmas Eve. They published it. Thank you for that. It made my Christmas Eve very interesting. And there's more work that's being done in that space as we kind of move forward. And all of this is happening during what we still have is a bit of a cost of living crisis. And I'm sure we all know people who might drive 4 or 5 miles or even further out of the way just to save a couple of pennies on petrol or diesel. Now, the amount that you can save if you can charge from home is more than a couple of pennies. It's extraordinary, like charging up your car and being charged £5 is a very different feeling to charging up your car and being charged 30. It's something that I think will be a bit of a challenge, a political challenge, because it's kind of untenable that 25% of the population pay a significant amount more than the rest. So my question is, with advancing EV tech, better education, and more charging solutions, will charge point operators struggle to make this transition just?
Now, when you say the charge point operators, I think you're mainly talking about the rapid and ultra rapid charge point operators, aren't you there?
I would disagree. I think it's a combination of both. I think certainly the business model for on-street residential charging is challenging. If you look back at the Competition and Markets Authority's report back in 2021, they highlighted it as being a really challenging space to work commercially. And that was reiterated at the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force. Forget what the report they produced. I think that was 2022. So it's partly due to the way that they charge, and in terms of charge and money charge, it's paying per kilowatt hour. And if you're dispensing a relatively small amount of electrons over a 24-hour period, it's not going to make you a huge amount of money. You've also got an asset base that's widely distributed. So it kind of speaks to your point earlier, Gemma, about the kind of costs of maintenance. I would love to see cheap, accessible, available residential charging on every street. But I just think that the business model is something that is going to continue to be a challenge.
I do have thoughts, as you can imagine, but I shall leave those a second, allow the other two guests to chime in if they have any thoughts. Gemma, any words?
I think initially 2 thoughts. One is that idea of origin charging encompassing sort of base charging as well, and that co-charger model, I think's a really important piece. The second one, not I guess so much for on-street charging operators, but if we take kind of residential charging as one piece of the puzzle, there's obviously for your kind of rapid and ultra rapid operators, there is a fleet transition as well, which is going to support them in their business. So it's not in silo, but yeah, it's a very complex issue.
Yeah, and I think does anyone know what the charging network is going to look like in 10 years? I don't think so. I think at the moment we are trying a lot of things, and ultimately we have to have the industry that embraces innovation, that creates the ability for trials to be run quickly, and if they fail, that's fine. We try something different, because we don't know what that future is going to look like. And so I think encouraging innovation across the industry is absolutely key. I suspect the blend is going to look quite different. So I suspect you are right, Ben. There will be a slightly different mix that we'll have. As we know, there's more and more hubs popping up. Maybe you have the increased amount of those. Some of the smaller sites start to fall away. Slight increase in on-street charging. Again, more home charging solutions. I think the mix will shift, but ultimately I don't think we necessarily know exactly what the future's like. So we've just got to encourage innovation, and where new products can be brought to market that can be trialled by people and by local authorities and by charge point operators themselves, support that wherever we can.
I think I've spoken to a lot of charge point operators about this, and a lot of them have gone on record on this podcast and talked about it, but I've had offline conversations with a lot of them. And there is a general feeling out there with what they call the pure play charge point operators. So the Fastneds, the Instavolts, the Ospreys, the ones who are not linked in with like a fossil fuel company or an OEM, for example, that the business model for actually surviving, they've got to put stuff out there to justify the investment. They've got to charge an amount to cover the investment, but then they want the utilization that will allow them to reduce the price so that they can then go and invest more. And somewhere down the line, that business model, I'm personally not sure whether it will work 100%. But linked in with that is the fact that we have 5 or 6 years of a land grab. So we've had CPOs going out there buying up, quote unquote, locations to put charge points in, not all of which are probably the best place for them to have put those charges in the first place. We are going to end up with, to your point, Ed, we're going to end up with a different charging landscape in 5 or 10 years' time. We have currently between about 70 and 100 charge point operators. Various people I've spoken to said that number could drop down to anything between 5 and 20. So there's going to be a lot of consolidation. There's going to be a lot of charge point operators that go out of business, but there's going to be a huge amount of stranded assets out there. Ones that are in the car park at the back of a hotel, single 50 kilowatt unit, which just is not going to be used, but still has to be paid for. And I think that's going to play into a lot into what you were saying there, Ben.
Can I just bring back in that Checkley Wood model as well? Because part of their, I think, financial model is that their income is not just based on the charging, it's based on selling the electricity back to the grid. So there are different business models coming up as well that might support the operators as they change and adapt to the future.
And I think that plays very much into the pure play aspect that I mentioned, because AW Energy, obviously, they're not a charge point operator. They are an energy producer. They're a turbine owner and operator that just happens to do charging on the side. So it's a different model. But yes, as John Fairley said a couple of weeks ago, he makes most of his money because he sells, I think he said at some point in a conversation, he said he sells something like 90% of his power from the turbine goes to the grid. And the other 10% is effectively subsidized for the charging on site. So that's how we can make that model work. Sorry, Ed, I jumped in on you then. What were you going to say?
Well, I think I was going to jump in there and say that there is a really important piece that people actually still need to see these pieces of infrastructure. They need to see the FastNed canopies in order to recognize that there are places that exist. Because once again, education, the amount of people that think there's no charging anywhere near me is extraordinary. And yet, you go onto something like ZMAP and you actually recognize that there's quite a few places that you can charge. And I do think that these CPOs, at least they give people a degree of confidence. Obviously, I think one of the things that some of us cost pavement solution providers are guilty of is just looking at the kind of raw cost of per kilowatt hour. Now that certainly is something which is, quite stark. You might be paying 7p compared to, well, up to 85p. And yet that was obviously discounting the capex. But I keep coming back to the thought that, a high mileage-ish driver could easily pay back the capex of a cross pavement solution within a year. So we're charging on my unit that we've got installed. We're charging one of the Uber drivers that lives on my street. He absolutely loves it, and he says that he'd happily pay a lot more than what we're looking to do as our price point in order to get one, because it means if he could use it and charge it overnight, he could be saving up to £300 a month. Now, yeah, it's a pretty compelling proposition.
And I'm personally of the opinion, whilst I take advantage of it wherever possible, the 7 pence a kilowatt hour overnight charging or similar tariffs, there are a number that are around that. It's a bit of a red herring because, well, a number of reasons. First off, it's a subsidised tariff. Electricity does not cost 7 pence a kilowatt hour overnight. It can do at certain times of the year and with certain amounts of use, but there is an operator out there that does 7 pence a kilowatt hour 24/7. So they have to be subsidising that. OVO Energy. Ben's looking at me going, yeah. They have a 24/7, 7 pence a kilowatt, just for charging, not for the whole house, just for charging. They have to be losing money on that at some point. Well, people look at me and they go, well, I could be paying 89 pence a kilowatt hour at one charge point operator or 7 pence a kilowatt hour overnight at home. And I go, well, no, actually, what you should be looking at is it's 89 pence a kilowatt hour at some charge point operators. But the benchmark you should be trading against is the price of wet fuel. 47, 48 pence a kilowatt hour. If you're below that, whether you're getting that on AC or DC charging, that is saving you money against petrol or diesel. If you're above that, then it's cheaper to go petrol or diesel. And that's kind of where I like to look at things when it comes to pricing. And I'm not sure whether we've drifted a little bit off the actual topic of conversation, but
we.
My bad.
But
My bad.
It does come back to the financials, and we respond to financial incentives, whether you're a household or a business or whatever it might be. And if you can make the numbers work, and if you can make them compelling, people will be more likely to make the shift. And at the moment, I don't see it as compelling as it needs to be.
Agreed. Any final comments from anyone? Good. Right. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to talk briefly about booking charges. So let me just get my notes here where I can see them. Right. I'm starting to hear a lot of people wanting to book charges, get on an app, reserve a slot for a given length of time, add a given arrival time, and just wait for you when you arrive. But as with a lot of these things, the devil's in the details. How do you guarantee that nobody comes in and nicks your slot before you arrive? What happens if you're late? What happens if you book 20 minutes, but it's the middle of winter and the charge is not going as fast as you want and you actually need 40 minutes? What if you turn up without a booking? Can you still get on? Now, don't get me wrong, there are solutions for all of these, but there's costs involved as usual. Now, I would imagine personally that CPOs would probably think booking's a good idea because it allows them to manage the queues, it allows them to manage utilization. But I could also imagine that the logistics of putting something like this in place could be a bit of a nightmare. At the moment, Arnold Clark are the only quote-unquote CPO that I know that currently provide this service. It's app only, which means you can't use something like plug and charge to reduce your prices, etc. They use ANPR to recognise registration numbers. They've got a little bit of wiggle room in the bookings so you can turn up late, etc. Now, I've actually used the Arnold Clark app for charging. It worked really, really well. But everything is done via the app, including the payment, because Arnold Clark like to control the customer. Now, someone like ZapMap could start to include booking functionality in their app, and that would increase the utility of the app and drive more people towards using it. But there's 1,000 ways of doing this, and not all of them are customer friendly. Now, organizations like HITRANS, for example, may look favorably on being able to provide this sort of service as you roll out the infrastructure in the Highlands, especially if you've got the situation that Ben was talking about, where you've got a lot of people who can't do off-street charging and need to be booking or using a public charger. But I suspect maybe my view of things is probably a little bit rose-tinted. So let me open this up to the group with a simple question. Why wouldn't people want to be able to book a charge in advance?
So I think it's a really good question, and we certainly talk about this a lot internally, and we talk about it a lot to CPOs. And I think there's two things I would think about. One is from a customer perspective, as we book hotel rooms or we book restaurants, we want confidence that the thing that we want to experience is going to be there and is going to be work for us. So does booking have a place in the overall landscape? Definitely think it does. Probably for specific use cases, not for all use cases, of course. But I can see definitely from a customer perspective that is a very good option that some people might want to use. I still think it's going to be a small minority for the most part. So maybe it's mainly fleets looking for optimization of their uptime. Maybe it's people that are staying at certain types of establishment and want to make sure that there's something there when they arrive. The other side of it is it the right solution for the problem? So what is the actual problem that we're looking to solve? And that is, there is a charger there that's going to work for me and I can access it when I need to. Now, booking is one way that you could solve that problem. Actually, orchestrating where people go could be a better way of doing that. So you might have someone, you talked about this on the ultra rapid charging episode recently, Gary, that goes to use one charger, but actually they're not getting the benefit of that charger because their vehicle doesn't have the capability to charge at that rate. So they should be going on to somewhere else, and we should be pushing the vehicles that can get that rate across to those higher power units so people can get back on the road quickly. And so you're effectively just optimizing people flowing through the system in a different way. So I definitely think it has a role. I definitely think we need to look at other ways we can solve this problem, which is confidence that there'll be a charger there and I'll get the experience that I want. I definitely see people playing around and doing trials in this area, and ultimately I think that's a really, really good thing. But definitely from our perspective, it is a complicated thing, and if you're putting more, I guess, cost onto the CPOs to effectively manage this and to enforce this and to penalise people if they use it in the wrong way, or make sure people use it in the right way and they don't get penalised for not turning up. Can CPOs take on that additional cost right now? Question. I'm not too sure on that. It's a bit of an interesting one.
It's, for me, and maybe it's just because I don't drive enough miles, but every time I've done a long distance journey, I go up to visit family in Scotland relatively often, I've never had a problem with actually queuing. And that was even one journey that I had on a busy bank holiday Friday. There were loads and loads of cars on the road. The MSAs, the motorway service areas, were really busy. And the only time I actually had to queue was actually, weirdly, to go to the urinal. I've never had to queue to go to the urinal before, and yet I could access a charge. Now, I'm not sure if that's changed, obviously, with the growth of electric vehicles. We're adding, an extra 30, 40,000 each month. So maybe that's going to become more challenging. But, there is a very difficult balance that those CPOs have to get between getting their utilization higher without getting their frustration of drivers higher. They can't afford to build out an infrastructure network which just copes with those peak time periods around Christmas or whatever. So I think there's a certain element of it that people just have to recognize, that you adjust your driving habits to suit. Like if I was going to try and travel up to Scotland on the 23rd of December, I think I'd probably seriously consider doing it at silly o'clock in the morning or sometime outward. Now, I think one of the things that you pointed out, Ed, was that it's quite different for fleet operators, because as well as the actual cost of charging, you've got the cost of your driver potentially sitting there waiting for an hour, and that can add up to a lot of money. But that's where I think that it might be the case that more of these commercial organizations that have their own chargers might have the ability to be able to allow other people to utilize them. So rather than it being a CPO thing, it might be something that is a private network that gets opened up, and you could book maybe with that. That could be maybe some sort of solution. I don't know. I'm not really well versed enough on this one.
I think you're definitely already seeing that, those sharing of fleets sharing their capabilities with one another. So yeah, I can absolutely see a lot of innovation in that space. Sorry, Gemma.
I was going to come in and say, yeah, I think from a Highlands and Islands point of view, and needing those chargers that are put in to be used as much as possible, then having that booking ability would be really important for us. But I know technology is still sort of being developed for that. And I've spoken to Police Scotland, for example, who can't use the Arnold Clark app. It's a security issue for them, but they can go into the store and book the charges with Arnold Clark as well, so they don't have to do it through the app. I've heard that contactless can override some booking systems, so it's not always fail safe. And then I think from a customer point of view, just coming back to what Ben was saying about that frustration, it's almost another layer of complexity when there's an awful lot for people to learn already. So maybe it's something that would come in more in the future for a public use. But it's not necessarily needed everywhere.
To my mind, there's two aspects that play into this. You've addressed one of them, Ben, which is that if you, as a CPO, have a network that's so big that nobody ever has to queue at any point, at any time of the year, you've overbuilt your network. You've spent way too much money. You shouldn't have that. So there is going to be an element in certain places at certain times of the year of needing to queue. And we've seen that primarily on the bank holidays, primarily on some of the grid serve charges, usually up around T-Bay and places like that. But the other aspect to that is if I don't have an electric car and I want an electric car, and one of the things I'm seeing that's appearing on the news is you're going to have to queue for hours to get your charge. The ability to say, well, actually, I've got an app that will allow me to book a charger, so I won't have to queue. That's another thing that breaks down the barriers between those who don't have electric cars and those who do. Now, as we've kind of identified here, and you said it specifically, Ben, the number of times that you've actually had to queue for a charge, tiny. And it's like, the range anxiety thing many years ago. You're going to run out of electricity because the range isn't enough. How many people do we know who've actually run out of charge in an electric car? I think I know one, and I think it's because he was pushing it a little bit too much. But the perception is there that it's going to happen. So things like being able to book a charger allow a certain amount of comfort to people who are maybe a little bit unsure about making the move.
I think I might kind of challenge that a little bit, just on account of the fact that those times when you're going to really want to book a charger are also the times when the roads are more congested, which means your ability to predict what time you're going to arrive becomes even more problematic. And I think that will be a challenge. Could you imagine if like you're trying to get somewhere and you got your charger booked for 11 a.m. and suddenly you've come across a hold up on the motorway and you're not going to get there till 11:40, and then you've lost your ability to charge. So what happens in those scenarios? I think sometimes there's an element of randomness and probability that just work, and you just got to kind of go with it.
Yeah, no, that's 100%. And you're right. I don't know what to say. You're right. You're never going to have a solution that satisfied everything, because you can allow a little bit of wiggle room in there to say, all right, you booked at 11. If you turn up at 15:15, that's fine. And from a user point of view, that works. From a CPO point of view, that doesn't work, because suddenly they've got a charger that sat there for 15, 20 minutes with people waiting to use it who can't use it because it's been booked. So their utilization is going to go down. So yeah, as I said in my introduction, the devil's in the details on this, but that's fine.
I think we need more. Who's that dude in the smoking jacket that GridServe engaged to act as a
Yes, the guy who managed it all and dealt with the queues and all that sort of stuff. I forget what his name is, but excellent initiative.
It made me chuckle.
It did, absolutely. Right, I'm going to move on now. I'm going to bring this segment to a close and move on to our cool EV or renewable thing. Gemma, do you have anything that's cool in the EV or renewable space that you'd like to share?
I do. It's new to me, so it may not be new to everyone, but hopefully it'll be new to some people. So I was talking to someone recently about the Charge My Street CPO, and I always assumed that was about on-street charging. But I learned that there is a big rural aspect to it, and that their sister company, Cybermore, have put in like a dedicated 4G network in a not spot in the Lake District. And over the course of a year, more than 500 unique devices connected to it, and they took over 50 emergency calls. So I just think it's a really good kind of evidence of the added value that charging can bring to a community, something that can work in rural locations. It's something that can help with that on-street charging provision, and that what you were talking about, Ben, with how those models are going to work in the future and what other revenue streams might they have. So I thought that was just a really cool renewable and EV thing.
Excellent. Ed, do you have anything?
I do. It's quite a simple one, but I just think it's pretty amazing. We've got 98 new electric buses hitting the roads in the southwest in the Bristol area, 24 already in use. New rapid charging depots in Hengrave and Weston-super-Mare, and some amazing numbers coming out of it. So each electric bus will save an average of 75 tonnes of carbon per year, which is amazing, which is the equivalent of taking 54 cars off the road. And when we talk about why we're doing all of this, I think that is a headline grabber. I think it's a really amazing story. And the fact that I think by about some point next year, about half of the region's buses will be electric. I think that's quite an amazing change.
Brilliant. I love that. Ember are another company based up in, I think, Dundee, who do a similar thing. They do Dundee to Glasgow on the electric buses. Fantastic. Ben?
Yes, I came across something rather interesting the other day, which kind of blew my mind. And it was this company that's creating these giant concrete spheres. And you might think, okay, what are you going to do with a big sphere? What you're going to do is stick a motor and a turbine on it and put it down deep in the ocean. So, where there's quite a bit of pressure, not super deep, but, continental shelf deep. And so you have a differential in pressure between the air pressure up above and obviously what's within the sphere. So when you want to charge the sphere, you pump air in and pump the water out when you've got excess renewable energy. And when you want to utilize that energy to cope with those peaks of demand, you just reverse the motors and it kind of acts as a generator. So it's a company called Sentensi, which stands for Stored Energy in the Sea or something like that. And they're done a couple of commercial trials, or not commercial trials, of first of a kind trials, and they're looking at kind of doing some big ones off the Californian coast at the moment. And it's just a really exciting solution to the intermittency problem that we have with renewables, because they're looking at short to medium term energy storage, and it seems like fun.
It does. It's a bit like it's like the gravity wells that they have where they drop weights down in mines and that, but it's a different aspect to that. Love it. Fantastic.
Yes.
My cool EV on renewable thing, Freitag, which is a Swiss company, have created a shoulder bag that's made entirely from a single material, including the zipper and the straps, that will mean that the whole thing can be recyclable. So this monomaterial design allows the bag to be shredded and recycled just like a standard plastic bottle. Now, one issue that a lot of quote-unquote recyclable products have is that some parts aren't actually recyclable. They need to be removed, and it's only the rest that gets processed. And that adds an extra layer of complexity and cost, and it usually means that a lot of the products don't end up being recycled at all. So with a single material, it all gets thrown in together, processed into plastic pallets for reuse. Love this solution to a known problem. Fantastic.
Very
Fantastic.
cool.
The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers in the UK, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence wherever you go. Download ZapMap and you'll get the UK's most comprehensive charging map in your pocket with a range of filters, so you can personalise the map to suit your specific EV model. That means you get the right charge for you every time. You can even see live charger availability and price information in the app, helping you turn up at the charge point with total confidence that it will work, it will be available, and it'll be in your budget. Plus, you can pay through the app at thousands of charge points nationwide. No need to download a different app for each charging network. You can download ZapMap for free or check out ZapMap Premium for charging discounts, in-car compatibility, and additional filters. So, I hope you all enjoyed listening to today's show, or indeed watching it if you're watching it on video. I'd like to thank my guests, Gemma Robinson, Ed Walsh, and Ben McDonald, for their chosen topics and the ensuing discussions. Thank you all. Thanks as well to all the listeners for their support this season. We'll be back again in July with season 14. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or other general messages to pass on to me, I can be reached at info@evmusings.com. On the socials, I'm on Blue Sky at evmusings.bsky.social. I'm also on Instagram at evmusings, where I post short videos and podcasts extracts regularly. Why not follow me there? Thanks to everyone who supports me through Patreon on a monthly basis and through coffee.com on an ad hoc one. Regular listeners will know about my 2 ebooks, So You've Gone Electric and So You've Gone Renewable. They're 99p each or equivalent, and you can get them on Amazon. Check out the links in the show notes for more information, as well as a link to my regular EV Musings newsletter and associated articles. Now, if you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got this point by messaging me at evmusings.bsky.social with the words panel beating. Hashtag if you know, nothing else. Thanks for listening. Bye.